Hello, hello. Hope you can hear me and see me okay. I'm seeing your comments. Hi, Kay. Hi, Dale. Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Dolores. And hello, Troy Astro. Okay, so tonight I want to spend a little time on the damage done by the pandemic. And thank you, Dale, for cluing me in on how the audio and video are going. That's good. Then I want to move to Jeff Epstein's post. He had a Naked Capitalism post, which is about the PPP program. And I should say the largely failing PPP program at this point, a highly disappointing PPP program, okay, at this point. And the reasons why it's failing are gone over very well in Jeff's post, which we will go over here. So what I'm saying is I'm going to spend a minimum of time on the first couple of things that I want to talk about. The first is unemployment, and the second is the death toll here in the United States due to COVID-19. Spend a little time on those. I'll spend somewhat more time on Jeff's article, okay, in Naked Capitalism. But then I want to spend most of the time on the attack on entitlements, which is shaping up in the Congress, okay, at this point. So I want to get to the nub of that attack and what the people who are trying to put forward the attack, who are putting forward the attack, are trying to get us to do. So let's begin. Let's begin by going to an article in Common Dreams. Oh, by the way, please share this. I hope you will. I'm counting on you to do that. I'm going to talk about an article by Heidi Shierholz from Common Dreams. Congress must do much, much, much more to help tens of millions of unemployed. Of course, I entirely agree with that. So last week, she counts 3 million more workers who applied for unemployment benefits. She says that is an improvement over the 6 million per week we saw in late March and early April, but it's an increase from the prior week and is still well over 3 times the work week of the recession of 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, okay, and so on. There were 2 million people who applied for state unemployment insurance, the regular unemployment insurance, and then another 1.2 million who applied for pandemic unemployment assistance. That's the new federal program, which is for workers who are not eligible for the regular unemployment insurance, such as the gig workers, who, of course, are out of work as a result of the virus. But there's an undercount of the number of unemployed here, because at this point, 15 states and D.C. are not yet reporting the PUA data, pandemic unemployment assistance data. So PUA claims are being undercounted. Okay, the author wants us to look at the 2.2 million unemployed on an unadjusted basis, because she says even though seasonal adjustments are usually helpful, they're used to even out seasonal changes and claims that have nothing to do with the underlying strength or weakness of the labor market. However, the way a Department of Labor does seasonal adjustments is distortionary at a time like this. So I focus on the unadjusted numbers when looking at regular state unemployment insurance. And the pool claims are available only on an unadjusted basis because they're one-time things, so they don't have the history to seasonally adjust things. So here's a graphic of the state, insurance claims. And you can see from March 29th to April 4th, 6.2 million, then 6 million, then 5 million, then 4.3 billion, then 3.5 billion. Then 2.9 million, 2.9 million, 2.4 million, 2.2 million. So the number of unemployment claims per week is certainly going down. However, there still are enormous number of new unemployment claims compared to the norm before the recession started, and even compared to the worst week of the recession unemployment in 2008, 2009, and 2010. So we're seeing unprecedented unemployment claims in the 9 weeks since March the 29th. And of course, we still have the 2 final weeks of May to go, in which we don't have a report, on the numbers yet. Of course, we've completed the final week, of May, the 3rd week, of May now, but we're waiting for the report, which will come on Thursday, as you know. But most probably, there will be another 2 to 3 million unemployed in this 3rd week, because the unemployment numbers don't show any sign of rapidly slowing down. So the author, Heidi Shierholz, of the EPI, then goes through a paragraph where she adds up all of the unemployment claims. And she concludes that's 36.6 million workers, close to 1 in 4 people in the workforce of the United States. And she points out correctly the situation is still deteriorating. And she says Goldman Sachs is forecasting that the unemployment rate will average more than 30% for May and June. And of course, millions are losing their health insurance since our healthcare system ties health insurance to work. So you all know about that. So then comes the point of the article. Policymakers need to do much, much more. For example, a prolonged depression is virtually guaranteed without significant federal aid to state and local governments. She says, indeed, we're at a fork in the road as a country right now. As of the middle of April, about 2/3 of workers who are out of work as a result of the virus report they expect to be called back to their prior job. Whether they will actually be called back, or whether those furloughs will turn into layoffs, is in the hands of policymakers. It will hinge on whether policymakers enact an effective plan of testing and contact tracing, that people will feel safe enough to re-engage in normal activity as the economy reopens, and whether federal policymakers provide enough aid to individuals, businesses, and state and local governments so that confidence and demand are relatively high as the economy reopens and as those furloughed workers are able to get back to work. I completely agree with this analysis and her claims about what going back to work is going to depend upon. She's absolutely right about that. Congress has to do much, much more. Of course, as you know, the Republicans are digging in their heels, both in the White House, in the Senate, Okay, and Nancy Pelosi thus far has been rather shy about passing the kind of relief that workers will need in order to support them until they can go back to work. The programs have been mostly ineffective thus far, as we shall see. And so there is much, much more to do. I wanted to note that because I'm covering the changes in the employment picture week by week as we go through this period. And I wasn't able to do it on Thursday night, so I'm taking it up now. So let us now move to another big result of the pandemic. And that, of course, is really the bottom line result, which is fatalities. We have to know about fatalities here. Please share this if you can. Okay, this article focuses on the modeling effort from Columbia University's school, of public health, the Mailman School, of public health. And they have an epidemiological model which looked at the virus's national spread through May 30th of 2020, at which point deaths had passed 65,000. Now, I have to note that as of this morning, the death count had actually passed 97,635, or it was at 97,635 as of this morning. So it's past that now. And it's on track to be close to 99,000 by tomorrow morning. And by the end of the weekend, it's on track to be over 100,000. But as of March 3rd, it had passed 65,000. The researchers found nearly 62% of reported infections, 703,000 cases. There are now 1.6 million cases or more, and 55% of deaths, over 35,000 people, could have been avoided if the same control measures that were implemented in mid-March were enacted just 1 week earlier. Just 1 week earlier, folks. Implementing those measures 2 weeks earlier, the modeling found, could have led to an 84% reduction in total cases. That is 960,937 cases. Okay, that was the number of total cases. And a nearly 83% reduction in deaths, 53,990 people, roughly 54,000 people. If Donald Trump had implemented those measures by March 3rd, 2 weeks earlier, then was done. They say our findings underscore the importance of early intervention and aggressive response in controlling the COVID-19 pandemic. And Jeffrey Shaman, or Shaman, I'm not sure how he says it, was quoted, "We have to maintain control of this virus, and as we loosen these restrictions, it's possible we could have the growth of the virus in a lot of communities if we're not careful. If social distancing practice should lapse, if people aren't wearing face masks as they start to go to businesses and restaurants and theaters. If we do not monitor this, and if we do not recognize it really early and jump on it, it's going to jump out of control again," Shaman said. "We're going to have problems again. We're going to have growth that's beyond our expectations. And we're going to see surges of people coming into hospitals again, which, of course, is going to overexpose our caregivers in our hospitals." So that's what he had to say. There's a little video there for you if you want to click on the link that I've given in the description, okay, and watch it. Okay, and the Department of Surgery at Columbia tweeted Thursday, "We must heed our own warnings, absorb this data, wear a mask as states reopen. Don't let the nonsense cloud your judgment." And as this article was written, the author points out, there were 1.5 million confirmed cases and 93,558 COVID deaths in the United States. Now, of course, it's over 1.6 million, and we're at 97,635. I think we're nearing actually 1.7 million. Now, we're also nearing, okay, another milestone they don't talk about here. If we measure things in deaths per million population, as of this morning, I computed that we were just under 300 deaths per million. 299 point something, okay, this morning. We're just on the point of going over 300 fatalities per million people. There are 330 million people that are in the United States at this point, and the total figure of deaths corresponds to nearly 300 deaths per million. Now, there are a number of other nations that are doing worse than that. For example, the nations of Europe that have been hit hard by this, Italy, Spain, and also the UK, are over 300 deaths per million. If I'm not mistaken, and I believe I'm not mistaken, Sweden is over 300 deaths per million. Much smaller country, of course, but it's over 300 deaths per million. Now, to keep in mind what an effective policy could have done, I would like to call your attention to Taiwan. No, that's not a part of this article. We've gone through this article now in terms of what we should be observing in it. I want to call your attention to Taiwan. There are almost 24 million people in Taiwan. They have a very good healthcare system there. They have had a Medicare for All system, which was passed during the 1990s, and which now covers everybody in the population. That healthcare system was designed by Americans who were brought over as consultants to help the Taiwanese government during the 1990s. One particular American, okay, whose name was Henry Aaron, by the way, was known for a long time as an advocate for Medicare for all. And he and the other American consultants basically advised the Taiwanese government to pattern their healthcare system after our healthcare system, but just extend the coverage to everyone in the population and make the copays, okay, and the deductibles extremely low, okay, or free, but have a Medicare for all system where the doctors were private, the hospitals were private, but the insurance was public. Okay, it was Medicare, and where people were free to go to any provider they wanted in all of Taiwan, as many times as they wanted to go see the providers, whether they were doctors or whether they were hospitals or whatever healthcare service they were providing. Taiwan has had that system since that time. Now, Taiwan, population-wise, not in terms of area, but population-wise, it's a fairly sizable country. It has 24 million people. It has a larger population than New York State does. But it has a Medicare for all system. Now, how have they done in fatalities per million? Well, as of this morning, they had 7 fatalities total, and they have 24 million people. So you do the arithmetic. But if I recall the arithmetic that I did this morning, that comes to 0.29 persons per million. Not 29 persons per million, but 0.29 of one person per million. That's the job that the government and the medical care system of Taiwan has done in handling this virus with an aggressive program of testing and contact tracing. Out of every million people, almost no one has died. Only 7 million people in the whole country have died. At the beginning of this, would anybody have thought that Taiwan would have deaths per million of 0.29 and the United States would have nearly 300 deaths per million at this point? No, at the beginning of this, the United States was reputed to be the most prepared country in the world for a pandemic. I submit to you the difference between Taiwan and the United States. The performance district in fatalities per million is a measure of the failure of this administration and our healthcare system. Both of these need to go. We need to have a Medicare for all system, most preferably the one that has been proposed in H.R. 1384. And we need to have a president and Congress that are hell-bent on passing Medicare for all. If we want to live, that's what we need. We have nearly 100,000 dead now. nearly 100,000 dead, for my money, needlessly dead. Had we been as good as Taiwan, we would have had something like 170 people dead in the whole country, not 100,000. You can tell me if you think my comparison is unfair. But Taiwan is a sizable country. And they used methods that were basically the prescribed ones. They did what was necessary. They shut down when they had to be shut down. They tested, they contact traced, they isolated, and they quarantined. One of our commenters tonight asked when the quarantine was going to end. We haven't had a quarantine. We never had a quarantine. We never quarantined people. Quarantine means the people are in isolation. We have never been in isolation in this country during our shutdown. It hasn't been that strict. You are always able to go out for food and for other necessities. We know because we've been doing it. It wasn't prohibited. So restaurants were shut down, or greatly inhibited anyway. So a few other businesses, types of businesses, were shut down. So we couldn't go to malls anymore. It wasn't any quarantine. All right. I wanted to talk about the two facets of damage from the crisis. How many people we've lost, how many jobs we've lost, what kind of economic misery is out there based on the kind of unemployment we've suffered. Now I want to move to Jeff Epstein's piece in Naked Capitalism and his analysis of what's been going on with the PPP, which I think is a very welcome analysis. We'll spend about 15 minutes on that and then move to the major topic, of the evening. So Yves Smith, the owner of the Naked Capitalism blog, has a little bit of an introduction to Jeff's piece, which gives us a handy-dandy listing of the requirements to apply for a loan under the Payroll Protection Program. And you can see, just from looking at all the items, this is hard for real small businesses to fulfill. It's not a matter of getting in a loan package in just a few hours. Maybe big businesses can do that, but regular small businesses can't. If you've ever owned a small business, as I have, you know that. I used to own and run a microcomputer business during the 1980s. And I'm telling you, probably would have taken me about a week to put something like this together. By a week into the program, it had run out of commitments already. Eves points out, let's just start with the current financial statement a bit. If you're a little business, those are prepared as incidental to doing your annual tax returns. Like many small businesses, I always get an extension. She says there are sound reasons why. So I don't have a current financial statement, nor could I even prepare one at this juncture, even if I wanted to, for more idiosyncratic reasons that are nevertheless sound. And if the point is to preserve payrolls and perhaps cover other expenses, why the demand for anything beyond proving up who you are and that the payroll and other expenses are indeed paid by that entity? Eves is right, of course. But now here comes Jeff with the details. Okay, Jeff Epstein. Who points out the PPP program is a part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the CARES package. It's an SBA, Small Business Administration loan program intended to provide a direct incentive for small businesses to keep their workers on the payroll during the COVID-19 health crisis. That's what the stated intention was of the law. Now, the problem with the SBA is, as Nathan Tankus, who was quoted in this article, says, quote, the forgivable loans running through the Small Business Administration are underwhelming and have historical problems in terms of being administered by banks and being slowed down and filtered through all the biases that banks have. Some FBA-approved lenders also have difficulty following the law, such as Wells Fargo, which in January settled with the United States Justice Department for 14 years of fraudulent activity against its customers, employees, and investors. Although the PPP is a loan program, the loans are forgiven, quote, if all employees are kept on the payroll for 8 weeks and the money is used for payroll, rent, of mortgage interest, or utilities, unquote. It is required at least 75% of the loan funds be used for these purposes. The SBA processed, and believe me, this is one agency of the federal government that has a remarkably low amount of administrative power because the agency has been starved for years and years and years by Republican administrations and partly by Democratic administrations too, though not as badly by Democratic administrations. But the SBA has been going under the knife for a very long time now. Its computer systems are creaky. It is understaffed, but the SBA processed more loan applications on the PPP's first day than it did in the entire year beforehand. Unfortunately, large corporations have raided the PPP with the vast majority of small businesses left in the lurch. A chaotic application process worsened the situation, ultimately resulting in only 6% of businesses receiving loans before the funds were depleted. If I had still been in the computer business, would never have been able to get an application in time before the funds were depleted. Of course, the funds weren't actually depleted in the sense that they were sent out because the SBA and the banks were too inefficient to make that happen. What happened instead was that a lot of loan applications were approved. So the money was committed and the funds were depleted in that sense, that the loan funds were committed. As reported by Reuters on May 5th, at least 41 companies received PPP loans despite, quote, already having enough to cover basic expenses for 2 months or more when they applied for funds. Some of these companies even showed optimism in recent press releases and regulatory filings. And then Oh, there's a list of companies with plenty of money that got sizable PPP loans. $1.3 million, 4.78 million PPP dollars, nearly 7 million PPP dollars in three different companies. And those are not the ones you've heard of thus far. Along with dozens of others, these companies certified on their PPP applications that current economic uncertainty makes this loan necessary to support their ongoing operations. On April 21st, the Financial Times identified a total of 83 publicly traded companies that had collectively borrowed more than 330 million from the PPP, on average 4 million each. On April 27th, the New York Times reported on a company known as the Domio, maybe it should have been the Domio, or Domio, maybe it is, I don't know how to pronounce it, a New York-based startup that most likely had enough cash to last until 2021, yet laid off staff, applying for and receiving a loan 3 days before the PPP's funds ran out. I guess they kept enough staff on board to do the PPP application. These companies took out loans despite already being flush with cash, despite also having access to capital markets, which means they have alternative methods for raising funds, such as selling stock. Some large companies like Shake Shack, which is worth $1.7 billion and received a $10 million loan, returned the funds in response to public backlash. In an open letter posted to the LinkedIn page, Shake Shack executives argued that the PPP came with no user manual and was extremely confusing. I suppose implying that that's why they applied, even though they didn't need the money by any stretch of the imagination. But, says Jeff, large corporations would not have been able to take advantage of the PPP if the program had not been, again, according to Nathan Tankis, quote, egregiously designed from a budgetary point of view, unquote. That's got to be the understatement of the year. Despite small businesses needing at least $700 billion to fund their payrolls for 3 months, Congress allocated only half that amount. And it took less than 2 weeks for the PPP to be emptied. Now, with the vast majority of its funds not in the hands of small businesses, but rather large corporations. This happened in large part, Nathan Tankis says, due to the structure of the PPP, which has provided loopholes for large corporations, put roadblocks in front of small businesses, could exacerbate racial inequalities and discriminate based on immigration status. To add insult to injury, 24 hours before the PPP's launch, in response to pressure by banks, the Treasury Department, to which Congress provided discretion over loan terms, which of course it never should have done. I mean, after all, why would you vote for a bill that would give discretion to Secretary Mnuchin, who might be a jailbird by now if he had been prosecuted by Kamala Harris when she had the chance? Prosecuted for mortgage fraud in California, of course. Anyway, the Treasury Department doubled the loan interest rate and greatly shortened the time small businesses have to pay it back. Right. so that lenders could commit fraud on the small businesses by not being plain with them about what they had to do to pay it back, right? If you go to Nathan Tankus's blog, he documents the intricate details of the U.S. inadequate response to COVID 19 with a focus on the role of the Federal Reserve. And Jeff points out Nathan's work has been quoted by politicians in the United States and abroad and in academic papers. In order to stop the spread of the virus, many who are ready and willing to work must stay home. In the words of Pavlina Chuneva, quote, a recession is sadly necessary, unquote. Instead of remaining in stasis until after the crisis, the lack of payroll funding forces small businesses to shed workers or their hours, beg for donations with GoFundMes, or shutter. This hurts employees and their families and the businesses those families shop at. This in turn affects the employees of those businesses and so on. In other words, the unemployment itself spreads like an infectious disease. In fact, an April 3rd poll from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a pro-business organization unaffiliated with the U.S. government and MetLife, shows a large percentages of small business are considering permanent closure within the next 3 to 6 months. And the Senate is fiddling while small business burns, continuing to fiddle. That was as of April 3rd. It is nearly 2 months since then. A large percentages of small businesses were then considering permanent closure within the next 3 to 6 months. Nearly 2 of those first 3 months are gone. Key findings of the survey include 43% of small businesses say they're 3 to 6 months away from permanently shutting down. 24% say they're 2 months or less from closing permanently. They may have been closed already. They may have shuttered by now. And 1 in 10 that say they are less than 1 month away from permanently shutting down. Well, I'm not going to go through the rest of this, but you get the picture. The COVID-19 and the coronavirus have been disastrous for small businesses, and the Congress is not providing the help that it needs to. And then in the section on the reality of federal finance, Jeff brings his MMT out. Worst of all, he says, the suffering is completely unnecessary. It's an arbitrary political choice. As is the case with all federally administered programs and benefits, it is impossible for the United States Congress to run out of money with which to fund the PPP. According to Texas Christian economics professor John Harvey, who's an MMTer, by the way, quote, there is 0% chance that the U.S. will be forced to default on the debt, unquote, who's known in his live streams, by the way, as the cowboy economist. According to former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, there is 0 probability of default. Yes, in testimony Alan Greenspan gave in front of Paul Ryan, when Paul Ryan asked him about the possibility of default and other things. Alan Greenspan was pleased to reply. He was pleased to give an answer that Paul Ryan did not want to hear. I wouldn't say that our entitlements are at risk at all. The federal government can pay for anything it needs to pay for, any obligation it needs to pay for. There is zero probability of default, quote unquote. And finally, economist Stephanie Kelton, who served as Democrats' chief Senate Budget Committee economist in 2015, and as the senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns, tweets, "The appropriations pen is out of ink," unquote. "I can't believe we're hearing, quote, we're out of money," unquote, in the early stages of a crisis. Again, she capitalizes. "The truth is, Congress can appropriate whatever it chooses. It literally cannot run out of money. And you'll hear more of that from me before this evening is over." She was replying to a statement, a tweet that was from actually Politico, and Politico said Senator was quoting Senator Lamar Alexander. "Congress won't be able to appropriate enough money to help everyone impacted by the pandemic," said Lamar Alexander, crying poor mouth again. Jeff says, "Congress is the only entity on earth constitutionally empowered to create U.S. dollars, which it does out of thin air. And he links to a YouTube from there. "And not so differently from how you or I enter the number 100 into a spreadsheet by pressing 1, then 0, then 0. To be more specific, Congress authorizes its creation, which is executed by its delegated agent, the Federal Reserve." What I would say there, I wouldn't quite put it in that way. Okay, what I would say is that what Congress does is to appropriate the money, which means that it mandates that the Treasury spend the money which it appropriates. Also, usually, it authorizes some program or set of expenditures as well. There's usually two stages, in regular order. Congress does an authorization bill, which it passes, but then it appropriates the money in a money bill. That appropriation does not create the money. It does not create the reserves in the Treasury spending account. It does not actually spend the money. The creation of the money, if needed, is executed by its delegated agent, the Fed. I say if needed, because if a sufficient amount of money to spend an appropriation is present in the Treasury spending account, then the Treasury can go ahead and spend the money, because it doesn't have to top up the Treasury spending account, in order to do that. But if it has to top up the Treasury spending account, then it has to do things that are necessary to require the Federal Reserve to create new reserves in the Treasury spending account, to top up the Treasury spending account or mark up the Treasury spending account sufficiently to do the spending. And Jeff says, to be even more specific, see here, and he links us to MMT Resources, which may state things in a slightly different way, probably closer to the way that I stated them. In addition, because the United States has full financial sovereignty, there is no purely financial constraint preventing Congress from funding the PPP for the duration of the quarantine and beyond, regardless its length. And he says Congress indeed has limitations, but they're real, not financial. Sam Levy, research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, distinguishes between real and paper problems. Renowned economist Abba Lerner argued for federal finance to be geared towards achieving a functional, quote unquote, not sound, quote unquote, goals. What he meant by that is that it should be geared towards achieving certain kinds of outcomes, certain kinds of real outcomes, not outcomes that are deemed to be financially sound, because the federal government can spend whatever it has to spend, and so its spending is always sound. Its fiscal sustainability has nothing to do with the level of its debt. It has nothing to do with the value of the debt to GDP ratio. Its fiscal sustainability only has to do with its success in maintaining the sovereignty of its currency, which the United States thus far has protected over the years and is not in immediate danger of losing unless the Republicans and Democrats do something really stupid. Now, of course, there's more than a zero chance of that, isn't there? Jeff says the button works fine. And he refers to the 2010 Citizens United decisions and the McCutcheon decision of 2014. Says that these made it possible for unlimited money to drown out small donors. It says on the 10-year anniversary of the CU decision, the New York Times concluded, the world CU created unlimited money in politics and legally unchallenged corporate personhood is now simply the toxic civic air we breathe, unquote. I'm glad the Times has said that. I'm glad they think that they believe it, but I have only one question to ask. If they really do believe it, then why aren't they supporting candidates for president who would do something about the world that CU created? Because as far as I can see, both of the candidates of the major parties are thoroughly tied into the CU system, and neither will do anything to weaken the hold their donors have over them, because they seem to be perfectly happy with that particular hold. So maybe in spite of the protestations of the New York Times, considering which of the major party candidates they supported throughout the campaign, it may be their words are belied by their actions. That was just an editorial comment on that. Further cementing the reality, on May 8, 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that many forms of political corruption simply do not violate federal law. Quote, embracing a view of the law that is unbearably bleak, unquote. That was a quote from Zephyr Teachout, who describes the shell game being played by the Supreme Court. Here's what ought to madden you in his decision in Citizens United, says Zephyr. Justice Kennedy said that we should not worry corporate spending would lead to greater corruption because bribery laws would still deal with our corruption problems. And then Zephyr concludes, then the court went ahead and weakened bribery laws, unquote. That's the shell game being played by the Supreme Court. Yes, the payroll protection program has serious problems, says Jeff. The cause, however, is not just those who abuse the system, but those who designed it to be abused, chose to needlessly throttle it on top of that, and then voted it into existence. Once it became law, these Congress people looked the other way while the abuse happened. Now, when it's too late, they turn around and act surprised. Yeah, you notice how surprised they've been acting that the PPP hasn't worked. Oops, we made a mistake. And then some Democratic Congress people say to Nancy Pelosi, well, how about correcting that mistake? And so Nancy Pelosi puts forward a bill which makes people who are lobbyists the C4 nonprofits or not-for-profits and the C6 not-for-profits makes them eligible for the PPP. So they can take, I don't know, what is it, 125 billion of it that might go to them, or maybe more. Small businesses that I didn't notice had any trouble, generally speaking. So Jess says, considering all the above, it's not surprising that programs like the PPP, along with many other U.S. laws, stop help from reaching those who need it most, while allowing those who need it least to plunder without limit or consequence. As the monopoly issuer of the U.S. dollar, only the federal government, led by Congress, can backstop the economic devastation we currently face in a way that leaves all parties whole. Congress has decided instead to artificially cap the PPP at levels that are woefully inadequate. Congress uses its full authority at the push of a button when it comes to large corporations, to lobbyists, corporate lobbyists, to the military-industrial complex, and the fossil fuel industry. Completely accurate, that. Unfortunately, when it comes to supporting American small businesses and the millions of workers and consumers who depend on them, Congress has decided, even though the button works just fine, to leave it unpressed. Okay, I'm not going to go through the rest of this, but you get the point. Jeff is clearly on the money here completely. And, there's a postscript on this. Postscript, sabotage, defund, claim it's dying, repeat till it's dead. And the larger issue is that Congress imposes false scarcity on federal programs under the guise of concern for, quote, fiscal responsibility, unquote. The same false scarcity threatens to permanently shutter the United States Postal Service, as reported last month by Naked Capitalism. And Jeff then talks about what's been happening to the Postal Service. And he points out Congress has forced, the USPS to do the impossible. That is to pre-fund the future health care benefit payments to retirees for the next 75 years. And to do this in an astonishing 10-year time span, meaning that the post office has had to put aside billions of dollars to pay for the health benefits of employees it hasn't even hired yet. In fact, that haven't even been born yet. It is now being claimed with faux consternation that the USPS is going broke and may have to be shuttered forever, empowering private shipping services such as by UPS, FedEx, and Amazon. And then there's a citation to me. The onerous provision was rammed through by the then Republican-controlled Congress. This was in, I forget when, 2004, 2006, something like that. The subsequent 2009 to 2010 Obama administration, which had control of both houses of Congress and, of course, the presidency, could have repealed the provision but did not choose to. Yes, I did say that. Absolutely. It's one of the big failures of the Obama administration that they didn't ram through a repeal of that particular provision that was placed on the USPS. In fact, I think what they should have done is restored the USPS to the level of a cabinet agency that it used to have, and appointed a postmaster general again as a cabinet officer. That's what I think the Obama administration should have done. But that damned neoliberal would never do something like that. While the USPS, a federal agency, must pre-fund all its retirees for 75 years in the future, the executives at many large corporations across the country get to further enrich themselves by brazenly plundering the pensions of their past, present, and future employees. Congress and the justice system have enabled this criminality for nearly a century while providing essentially no justice for pensioners. And Jeff points to an episode of the podcast Historically that he recorded last year, where he discusses this topic in detail. It says the written description also contains a substantial overview. And Stephanie Kelton then is recorded as tweeting, when the hashtag MMT coin drops and you realize the suffering is gratuitous. And that's in reply to a tweet by Tiffany Hayden, who replied to Stephanie, it's been 1,737 days since Flint, Michigan has had clean water. It was already difficult to live with what has been allowed to happen. But learning that money could easily have been obtained but wasn't makes this especially sadistic, and cruel. Now, that is an experience that all of us have had when we reflect on the austerity that this country has shown to most people during the decades since the 1980s, actually. Since the 1980s, the austerity that has been shown to most of our state and local governments and to most of our people since that time, in the name of fiscal responsibility, when we learn MMT and we realize that all this time these people have been talking about faux fiscal responsibility, not real fiscal responsibility. What is real fiscal responsibility? It is actually legislating for the public purpose and for spending for the public purpose that in no way undermines the monetary sovereignty of the federal government, so that fiscal sustainability is never harmed by that kind of spending. That's what real fiscal responsibility means. It means passing laws that enhance the public purpose as people see that purpose, and that does no harm to the fiscal sovereignty of the United States. Because as long as the United States has its monetary sovereignty, it has no fiscal sustainability problems whatever. That is the truth of the matter. Specifically, it can never run out of money. It can never become insolvent. So now, let us go to what many of you have been waiting for, which is entitlement programs and the attack on entitlement programs. And here we go, an article that appeared in Common Dreams. Let me share the screen for that article so you can see that article. I've given links to these articles, by the way, in the description, so they are available to you. By the way, please share this, and share, like, and subscribe. This was published on Friday, May 22nd, just yesterday. Headline is GOP plot to go Social Security behind closed doors gains steam in the Senate COVID-19 talks. And this article was by Jake Johnson, their excellent staff writer. And there's a picture of Mitt wearing a face mask as a preventive measure and a glove. He's probably wearing only one glove so he could open doorknobs and touch surfaces without having his bare hand actually touch anything. And looks like he has a really nice mask, like maybe he has one of the respirator masks that the rest of us have not been able to find. That looks like a pretty nifty mask. And of course, he has a suit that must be a $5,000 suit, but that's Mitt. Anyway, a proposal by Senator Mitt Romney to establish congressional committees with the specific goal of crafting legislative solutions, quote unquote, for America's federal trust fund programs has reportedly resurfaced in GOP talks, that is, talks among the senators, over the next COVID-19 stimulus package, sparking alarm among progressive advocates who warn the Utah Republicans' bill is nothing but a stealth attack on Social Security and Medicare. And Politico's reporter Burgess Everett reported Wednesday that Romney's Trust Act, first introduced last October with the backing of a bipartisan group of senators, is getting a positive reception from the Republicans in coronavirus relief discussions still in their early stages. Everett also says this legislation could become part of the mix for the next COVID-19 stimulus bill, as Republicans once again claim to be concerned about the growing budget deficit. Actually, they claim to be concerned about not simply the deficit, but the debt, which they assume that it inevitably requires. It's the debt that they're really worried about as a bottom line. Now, they didn't mind increasing the debt when they all voted for tax cuts for the wealthy. Now, is it twice or three times? Okay, I forget, but they've been going nuts with tax cuts for the wealthy. Actually, for a few years now, not just in the context of COVID. And they never claimed to be concerned about the budget deficit when they passed the CARES Act, which had such a big slush fund for the large corporations in it. Then they never claimed to be concerned about the deficit. But since then, you keep hearing about the debt and the deficit, rumblings from them. And the president and CEO of National Committee to Preserve Social Security and the Medicare program, that's NCPSSM, told Common Dreams in an interview. The director, the president and CEO did, Max Richtman. He said he's not at all surprised to see Romney's bill crop up again and said it should be diligently opposed. He vocally condemned the Trust Act when it was unveiled last year in October, by the way, before COVID-19. So what does it have to do with COVID-19 relief? What does it have to do with it? It's something they introduced earlier, because they had put through the tax cuts already, and they had huge deficits already, like $1 trillion deficits. And so all of a sudden, after causing those deficits themselves, they were for fiscal responsibility. So that was introduced in October. Nobody was breathing COVID then, as far as we know. Anyway, the NCPSSM warned that if passed, the measure, quote, would likely result in cuts to the earned benefits of seniors, people with disabilities, and survivors, all the beneficiaries of Social Security, okay, in other words. And Rickman noted that in the House Ways and Means Social Security Subcommittee roundtable discussion this week, the idea of establishing commissions to study possible changes to Social Security, though not Romney's bill specifically, was floated by GOP members, an indication that the New Deal era program is very much on the minds and potentially in the crosshairs of Republican lawmakers. It has been that way, by the way, since at least the 1980s. Of course, it was that way in the 1940s also. But for a while, they laid off Social Security because it was considered the third rail, okay, of American politics, so they laid off it. But there was a so-called Social Security funding crisis, which wasn't really any kind of funding crisis in the early 1980s, okay, and the Democrats, being fiscally responsible at that point, made a famous compromise with the president, okay, President Reagan, which was supposed to bail out Social Security forever by double taxing the generation of people that I was a part of and other people were a part of, raising our Social Security taxes in order supposedly to create a great surplus for Social Security to prevent its ever running out of money. We now have that surplus at something like $2.8 trillion or something like that. But guess what? It is now projected to run out by 2034. Okay, now the compromise was done in 1983. So that's between 1983 and 2034. It's far from forever. I mean, I guess that would be 51 years, but 51 years isn't forever, right? So, what Rickman also said is Social Security is the piggy bank that Republicans seem to go to whenever it dawns on them that we've got to do something about the debt. Notwithstanding the fact they passed a huge tax cut that added trillions to the debt and benefited most wealthy individuals and corporations, and Max failed to mention, how about the bailout they just gave to the largest corporations? That doesn't count the money that large corporations could also collected through the TPP. I'm sorry, through the PPP, not the TPP. Sorry to get my alphabets mixed up here. Speaking to Politico this week, two Republican congressmen, Representatives Tom Reed of New York and Stephen Womack of Arkansas, cited the coronavirus pandemic's possible effects on Social Security to call for a commission to study the program and recommend reforms. And Representative John Larson, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, is pushing for an expansion of benefits funded by lifting the payroll tax cap, which would make wealthier Americans pay more. And Womack says, I don't know when we're going to decide to take up the issue. I hope and pray that it's not when we have no other real options other than something draconian like big cuts. Okay, this is all baloney sausage, people. This is all baloney sausage. Because it relies on the fallacy that what's in the Social Security trust fund, in the trust funds, actually pays for any of the entitlement programs. And what you and what these people have to understand, if they do not now understand it and are simply lying about it, and is simply telling one big fat fairy tale, is that the trust funds don't have any funds in them. They are accounting records of what is owed to those programs by the Treasury Department. But those funds that were collected from us in the form of the Medicare taxes and the FICA contributions, those funds do not go into a bank account anywhere. They do not fund anything. They get destroyed in Federal Reserve settlements of the payments. And then new money is deposited in the Treasury spending account. And that is money that is not earmarked for any particular program. It doesn't go to the entitlement programs, but per se, it goes to whatever the federal government has to spend for, which means part of it may go to entitlement programs. Part of it may go to the military. But part of it can go to infrastructure spending. But part of it can go to education spending. In other words, it goes all over. The spending is totally divorced from what happens to the tax money. The tax money that is supposed to fund these trust funds does not, in fact, fund anything. It's destroyed in settlements. If you go to the Social Security Administration, nowhere do you find a Social Security bank account that pays any funds out of the Social Security Trust Fund. How does government finance actually work with respect to Social Security? The way it works, is this. You pay your FICA. You pay your Medicare taxes. You pay your taxes for other federal programs that have trust funds, that are attached to them. As I said, in the settlement process, those dollars that you have paid get zeroed out by the Federal Reserve, and entirely new reserves are placed in the Treasury spending account to top it up on a dollar for dollar basis for the tax revenue that was destroyed by the Fed. Then the money in the Treasury spending account gets spent indiscriminately on various federal programs. How it gets spent has nothing to do with the origin of the money in the taxation programs. Nothing. These are independent functions of the federal government. So, nothing is spent from the trust funds. If you had a picture in your head that the way Social Security is funded is that your Social Security contributions are collected and then somehow transmitted to the Social Security Administration, or even if they're transmitted to the Treasury, that somehow the Treasury gets that money to the Social Security Administration which keeps that money in some account to be used at some future time to pay out Social Security benefits, that is not what happens. The trust fund, the Social Security Trust Fund, has nothing to do with the actual spending in terms of operational day-to-day details and month-to-month details. There is no transaction that passes money from the Social Security Administration to the Treasury spending account. There are no dollars from some Social Security spending account that comes to you from the Treasury Department. There's only money created by the Fed to top up the Treasury spending account that comes to you as your Social Security benefit each month. That's the truth of the matter. None of the actual financial dynamics taking place inside the government involve the Social Security Trust Fund. All that happens with that fund is that an accounting record is kept. So let us say $650 billion a year is collected in FICA taxes. Then that is noted in the accounting record. Okay, it is marked down in the accounting record that Social Security has $650 billion more dollars to spend at some future time that the Treasury Department owes to Social Security. But no money is sent Social Security's way. No money is sent from your Medicare taxes to the Medicare trust funds. There's no money that is sent into highway trust funds. There's no money that is sent into any of the other trust funds that exist in the federal government. They don't exist as money. They exist as accounting records. So what the hell are these Republicans trying to get? They're not trying to get the money that sits in the Social Security Trust Fund. They are trying to fool people into thinking that since the trust fund, quote unquote, is projected to run out of money in 2034, and I should be clear about what the running out of money actually means in this case. It means that there's a financial projection that says that accounting record is going to hit the zero mark in 2034. And then the projection says that thereafter, the current Social Security tax revenue, the current FICA contributions, will only cover 3/4 of what is projected to be paid out by Treasury in the form of your Social Security benefit. So they're saying that the trust fund is going to run out of money, and therefore it will be impossible for Congress to appropriate your full Social Security benefit that you would otherwise be due in 2034. That Congress will only be able to pay go 3/4 of your scheduled Social Security benefit in 2034 under current law. But what is current law? And who controls current law? What current law says is, okay, it does say that Congress cannot appropriate, it cannot appropriate more in Social Security money than is in the Social Security trust fund account. In other words, that is in the accounting record for Social Security. That's what current law says. But the real problem is not that there's any money running out of that record. There's no money in that record. It's just a record. It's just a bunch of numbers having no financial reality. There's only a legal reality that the current Social Security Act says that Congress should not be appropriating more than is in that particular accounting record. Okay, but what if we say, to hell with it? That's not any kind of emergency right now. So we have a projection that the accounting record is going to fall to zero in 2034. So what? When 2034 comes, we'll just have the Congress appropriate the whole amount for Social Security. How about that? What happens if Congress should do that in 2034? I'll tell you what happens. Congress would be passing a new appropriations bill, okay, an Appropriations Act. The president would be signing that new Appropriations Act. Once the act is signed, the Treasury Department is mandated to spend the full amount of your Social Security benefits. And what would that all amount to? I'll tell you. It would amount to Congress repealing the provision of the current law that says that Congress cannot pass an appropriation that is greater than the amount that is left in the Social Security Trust Fund. The same thing applies to all the other trust funds. Whether Congress appropriates an amount that exceeds what's in the trust funds depends on what Congress wants to do. The earlier Congress that passed the Social Security Act doesn't bind the future Congress sitting in 2034 from appropriating whatever benefit is due to programs or people that had something to do with the trust funds. In other words, what's in the trust funds doesn't bind the Congress in 2034. Or since some of the forecasts, the projections are saying that Medicare is going to run out of money by 2026, it's not going to bind the Congress of 2026 to not appropriate more money. And to just say, to hell with the trust funds, we're appropriating the money for Medicare for All anyway. The point is, the trust funds were kind of a tie our own shoelaces device for the Congress, that people in the Congress should shout and scream about fiscal responsibility because the trust funds were running out of money. But the truth is, the trust funds have never had anything to do with money. There's never been any money in those trust funds. The only money is in the Treasury spending account. That's it. That's all she wrote. And that's all she's going to write. There's never going to be a separate bank account for Social Security. There's never going to be a separate bank account but for Medicare. These are things that come under the heading of Treasury spending. And that spending has to be appropriated by the Congress. Now, if we did with the Social Security Trust Fund what we do, okay, with Medicare Part D, which is to have Congress appropriate the money for Medicare Part D 1 year in advance, and we did that for Social Security, and we did that for Medicare, and we did that for all the other trust funds, guess what? All the projections under current law, assuming that change in current law to a new current law, all the projections under current law would be projecting that all those programs were solvent to infinity, that they were solvent as far as the eye could see, because current law would require the appropriations to be voted on 1 year in advance, okay, instead of in the same year. That's all it would take. And why is that true? Because underlying all these trust funds is the truth that under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, whether money gets created or not is in the hands of the Congress and the agencies that it delegates the money creation power to. Those agencies are, of course, the Congress itself, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Department, which still has the power to coin money, and which lately, in the mid-90s, received the power to coin 1 ounce but platinum coins with face values at the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury. In other words, face values that are unlimited or undefined in terms of the amount that can be placed on those coins. We can have a $1 trillion coin. We can have a $100 trillion coin. We can have a $1 quadrillion coin. And the Treasury Department has the power to mint those coins. Now, the money from those coins would not be spendable by the Treasury Department without a congressional appropriation. Congress has the purse strings. Treasury can't spend any money that hasn't been appropriated by the Congress. That's the control. But the power to coin money has been delegated by Congress to the Treasury Department. So let's say 2034 rolls around and nobody has done anything to tax people more for Social Security or to put any more money into the trust funds, quote unquote, or to do anything else. Just let the status quo go, and 2034 comes around. And Congress is then faced with, well, what are we going to do? There's nothing left in the Social Security Trust Fund account. Is Congress really going to take the position that we're only going to pay out 3/4 of the benefits due to Social Security recipients? Because if Congress does that, there might very well be lynching parties closing in on the doors to Congress. In other words, that would not be a viable political course of action. If the trust funds go to zero for Social Security and for Medicare, and by then it's going to be for Medicare for all, if the trust funds go to zero, Congress will just say, to hell with the trust funds. We have the power to appropriate that money anyway. So forget about the trust funds. They are literally just a device to fool you about where the money comes from and where the money is and how the money comes to be. In our present system, the reserves to top up the Treasury spending account in one way or another always have to come from the Fed. The appropriations untying the purse strings always have to come from the Congress. And the spending that is appropriated by Congress always has to come from the Treasury. And even when Treasury mints high-value platinum coins, like the high-value platinum coins, such as $1 trillion coin, that money goes into the mint's account at the Fed, and the Fed swaps the coin for reserves that eventually end up in the Treasury spending account. So these days, almost everything the Treasury spends on the basis of reserves that the Fed has created and placed in the Treasury spending account. Only very little money comes from the coins that are actually directly created by the Treasury Department. It's only a few $100 million a year in seigniorage, okay, at this point. Platinum coin seigniorage would be far more. Okay, but of course, if you gave the Fed $1 trillion coin, it doesn't put the $1 trillion coin into your spending account. What it does is mark up the Treasury spending account for the value of the $1 trillion coin. And then you just spend the reserves or the electronic money. And that's the way, okay, it works. So I shared with you the article about what Mitt and the other Republicans are doing right now and how they're trying to fool you. And I also have a link, which turns out, okay, I'm sharing now, which is actually something from Mitt Romney's site itself. That is from the Senate site, okay, of Mitt Romney. And it was an article that was published, okay, at the end of October, and points to the Republican and Democratic senators who introduced the Time to Rescue United States Trusts, the Trust Fund Acts. It says they'll be exhausted in the next 13 years. And it's irresponsible for Congress to keep ignoring a preventable crisis. There is no crisis. When the year comes around, all Congress has to do is to appropriate the money but necessary to fund those particular programs at that particular time. If the Treasury has any problems in selling debt instruments or doesn't want to sell debt instruments, then all the Treasury has to do is to mint the platinum coin to cover the shortfall. Or if the Congress wants itself to cover any shortfall, all it has to do at that time is to order the Federal Reserve to fund the full benefits that have been promised under the law. That would be the fiscally responsible thing to do. Spend for public purpose without harming the fiscal sustainability of the United States. Keep in mind, if those trust funds are all zeroed out at some particular date in time, this has nothing to do with the solvency of the federal government. And it has nothing to do with the programs that the trust funds are supposed to somehow represent. Congress is still free to fund those programs. And by the way, Congress is free not to fund those programs as well, no matter how much money is in those trust funds. You could have $100 trillion in each of those trust funds, but if Congress decided not to appropriate the spending for a particular year, then that spending would not happen. What's in the trust funds has nothing to do with congressional appropriations unless we believe the malarkey that the trust funds do have something to do with it. They're just creating a political trap for us so they can say no to federal spending that people need. Don't fall for it. Do not fall for it. Just insist on your rights. Your entitlements are your rights. Make sure that they keep your rights. So I gave you the link to this article reporting on the introduction of the bill on October 19th, way before the coronavirus. So that's the truth about the entitlement trust funds and Social Security. Now I'm going to turn to your comments. Okay. So I hope you've been sharing. I should, before I go to your comments, I should here flash my reminder banner to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And to please remember my Patreon link at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And there it is again. And now let me go to your comments. So taking it from the top, how are some got to straighten up and for the quarantine to end, at least the first wave? I don't know if I understand that comment. Troy says, I know about the virus from the Young Turks and I'm fine. Stay safe, stay at home. Okay, Troy. Troy says he's a Bernie-crat from Detroit. Great, Troy. And Kay says shared, and Dolores says shared. Jeff says, good evening, everyone. Excited to hear Joe's take on my new article. So cool, the Naked Cap one. Kay says, hi, Jeff. Deborah says here. Rick Maynard says evening all. Sandy says hello. Kay says, hi, Sandy. Kay says, no, Medicare for all sure isn't going to happen with Biden, SMH. That's why I've been wanting to get Biden out of there since this happened, since it started. Steve says 97,414. According to my COVID tracker, it was 97,635. But okay, these will vary somewhat, okay, a little. Okay, the important point is we're very likely going to be over 100,000 by the end of Monday. We'll probably find that out on Tuesday morning. By the end of the weekend, okay, the Memorial Day weekend, not the end of the month, before the end of the month, by May 26th, is it 26th, 23rd, 24th? Yeah, by May 26th, we'll find we're over 100,000 fatalities. And also over more than 300 per million as well. Rick Maynard says heavy population density in Taiwan as well. Jeff says Joe is quoted near the end of the article, and the final section also includes a link to a post by Joe on New Economic Perspectives, link titled Fiscal Responsibility. Joe also is the reason the article says via Congress's agent, the Federal Reserve. There's also something else influence, but don't recall what it was at the moment. That's all right, Rick. I mean, Jeff. That's all right, Jeff. I said Rick because I was scrolling down towards Rick's comments. How some cities flattened the curve during the 1918 flu pandemic. Social distancing isn't a new idea. It saved thousands of American lives during the last great pandemic. Here's how it worked. Oh, that's really a very nice historical link, Rick. Thank you. Very nice. And Jeff says, dummy O, laugh out loud. Jeff says, I've heard this article hundreds of times in my own head, writing and revising it. Hearing it from someone else just shows how gobsmacking it is. Yeah, it's a pretty good article. It really is. Bonnie says we should start to work on our roads and bridges to help restarting work for people. It's a lot of outside work. Yeah, it's good as long as people don't have to get too close to each other, as long as they can wear masks while they work. It'll be great. Kay says, yes, Bonnie, needed everywhere. Jeff says, I'll leave all parties whole line. I learned from Joe. You did? Gee, I thought a bunch of people were saying that. Anyway, Kay says they also want the USPS gone, so we can't vote them out easily. Jeff said, that was such a treat. Thanks so much, Joe, and thanks for being gentle in your criticism regarding the specifics of spending. Sandy says, shared. Thank you, Sandy. And Sandy says, hi, Kay. And Russ says, I need to turn in. See you again soon. Thanks for coming, Russ. Kay says, they just want the old and vulnerable gone. God forbid we should take care of American citizens. God forbid. Rick Maynard said, that's something we've needed for a long time. Putting on my hat, Kay, union activist, one of the problems with this suggestion is time. First, contracts must be written, projects determined, and then put out for bid. All these things take time. The time it takes is determined by the size of the project. This takes several years. The construction industry does not run in sync with the U.S. economy. We lag on the recovery, and we also lag on the downturn. Projects typically get finished, but new programs. Then he stopped there. And Dolores says, good night, Russell. And Kay says, my hubby had a death warrant of stage 4 cancer, was then finally approved to get SSDI in March, except he died in January. What crap they pull. Okay, and Mena Vanessa Shazada says, I'm sorry for your loss. And Kay says, thank you, Mena. I lost him and everything else I ever worked for in my life. From age 16, I will never get over that. Evelina sends 3 hearts. Evelina says, no money in the trust fund. Can you believe that geezer? Yeah, he's a geezer, all right. Susan says, is there anyone in Congress who understands this? I think Bernie understands it. I'm sure Bernie understands it. I'm sure AOC understands it by now. Okay, I bet you Rashid understands it. She certainly understands that you could just fill up the trust funds with platinum coins anytime you want. Lana says, evenly, it's just accounting, a glorified spreadsheet and used to keep the sheep convinced we can increase the amount of SS people receive. All political theater. Evelina says, oh, I know, it's organ grinding, for lack of a better term. Such stupidity causing so much suffering. We really need to be angry about that And we need to show our anger. I don't think we want to be polite to them anymore. I mean, they're lying to us, and there are a bunch of them who probably know they're lying to us. Mitt is smart enough to know that he's lying to us, that this whole thing is a fraud. So he's perpetrating a big fraud on us with this approach he's taking to cutting Social Security. He wants to cut Social Security, so he's telling everybody a fairy tale so they will not blame him for cutting Social Security. Instead, they'll say fiscal responsibility. That's what they'll say, fiscal responsibility. This is gaslighting at its finest. It's gaslighting at its finest. Do I think Romney will be successful in his attempts to cut Social Security? Well, I don't know whether he'll be successful or not. It's going to depend on Nancy Pelosi. It's going to depend. When Nancy Pelosi gets into the negotiations, who knows what she's going to negotiate away? We don't know what she's going to negotiate away. If she negotiates cuts to Social Security, well, our job in a way is still the same. We got to make sure the Republicans get absolutely defeated in the Senate and absolutely pushed out. We have to make sure there are more progressives in the Senate. We have to make sure there are more progressives in the House. We have to make sure that Nancy Pelosi is never the speaker again. We have to get someone in there who's going to understand that the trust funds are just an accounting record and that it's about appropriations, and who then turns around and appropriates, not cuts to Social Security, but increases to Social Security. That's what we have to do. The job is the same. We can't be deterred from the job. I mean, the job is to take over the freaking Congress and to take back the executive branch. And by the way, as far as the courts are concerned, if we have the other two branches and we're willing to be as ruthless as the Republicans have been, in appointing and ramming through all the justices they have rammed through, then we can bring things back to normal by restoring the balance. We can do this either by impeaching the judges they appointed in such haste, or we can do it by expanding the various courts that have been filled with their justices, and we can fill them with an equal or greater amount of justices who are progressive. After all, if we have the Congress and we have the executive, and we have margins that are big enough, and we put pressure on the party, whichever party we voted to place in office, in order to take control of things and push them in a progressive direction. There's nothing we can't do if we have a Congress which is friendly enough to our point of view. So it's up to us to organize and to get those things done. It's up to us to explain to people that this whole thing is gaslighting, the whole thing is a fraud, it's all a bunch of lies, and we can never back off that position. The position that Romney is taking and the other people are taking, they are a pack of lies, and we have to start calling them a pack of lies. And we have to start pointing out that all these people are gaslighting us, and we're not going to take their gaslighting. We're going to get rid of them at the first opportunity. Now, we'll probably never defeat Senator Romney in Utah. That may be too tall an order, but we can probably take care of the rest of them who are playing this game. Rahul Majumdar says, There's always money for the Pentagon and Wall Street bailouts. And that's another thing we have to do. See, there's no more money for the Pentagon and Wall Street bailouts. And Kay says, could any of you live on less than $700 a month? I don't think I could. And Kay says, that is what I have to try to deal with. I know I could. Sandy says, Congress holds the purse strings. And she's right about that. And Rahul said, and Kay says, Congress sucks. And Rahul says, what did Rahul say? He says gutting the USPS and Social Security are political, not economic decisions. Absolutely. That's true for Medicare, too. Sandy says it's cruel. Evelina says, hashtag punch the Pelosi. Hashtag give the plebes ice cream. Susan says, wouldn't Congress have to do a constitutional amendment to cut Social Security? No. No, it wouldn't have to do a constitutional amendment to either cut Social Security or increase Social Security. I mean, Social Security is just a law. That's all it is. No constitutional amendment necessary. Kay says they haven't so far, Susan. And Rahul Majumdar says Sunday New York Times cover page with names of U.S. COVID deaths. With names of all 97,000 some odd deaths, Rahul. But Evelina says the masses would be up in arms. They're not that stupid. Susan says we need MMTs to write some articles on why SS is in no danger of going broke. I've written those articles already. I mean, they're on my site. They're on my site. Just link to them and get them all over. I mean, I've got the articles. I've got the receipts. It's all written already. Stephanie's got the articles. She's got the receipts. It's written all over. Rick says, night all, wife's hovering, housework to help with. And Dolores says, good night, Richard. Susan says, I think Elhan Omer gets it. I heard her saying money is not scarce at the federal level. Yeah, I think she gets it too. The squad knows. The whole damn squad. Ro Khanna knows. And Jayapal knows. And Dolores says, Pelosi must go. And Susan says, but Pelosi is a huge Pete Peterson, Deficit Hawk fan. Yes, she is. Her connection to Peterson's are outlined in my, I believe in the first of my 2 volumes on called Real Fiscal Responsibility. One is about how the progressives play the give-up game, and the other one is about the Peterson network. And Rahul says Nancy Pelosi will negotiate for more chocolate ice cream. Joshua Lawson says, impeach, all in all, there, redo it. Some stay, most go. So, Josh, are you any relation to Alex Lawson? Evelina says they probably all know. Kay says Biden has been an SS cutter for 40 years, too. Not much hope there. Josh says, we want Jesse Ventura. I'd like Jesse Ventura, too, but we'd probably have to explain to Jesse why it's got nothing to do with the trust funds. Joshua Lawson says, I speak fluent Spanish, though I look like Abraham Lincoln. Well, I kind of think Abraham Lincoln looked a little bit Spanish. Don't you think so? And Sandy says, does Jesse know MMT? I mean, Abe Lincoln didn't look like no wasp. He was, but he didn't look like one. And Josh Lawson says, I'd stand by him, Jesse, and on corruption's false charge me at 16, messed whole life up. I got proof now. I've had just been, need help. To get lawyer, I donate, have my lawsuit for Jesse Ventura 2020. Susan says, funny how some members of Congress never worry that money for the military will run out. They know very well it's never going to run out. How do they know it? From World War II, we spent an enormous amount. In World War II, it never ran out. Josh says, if I got 500,000, it was 2 years, my life, 5,000 fines. I'd give Jesse half in support. Facts. And Evelina says, personally, only to debilitate the bad guys, steal their votes. Not my first choice. I need Jesse to call me ASAP. Seriously, God knows I'm not lying. Evelina says, though. Susan says, we need to start sharing from then. Evelina says, hilarious. Okay, Aurora DeBarra says, every dino in Congress and Senate must be forced out. Yep, I agree. Okay, I think I read it all. I think I'm ready to say goodnight. Oh, Susan says, I meant to say a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. That would be one excuse they could use to cut Social Security. No, it won't be, because Social Security doesn't add to the deficit, but not in general. I mean, right now, there's $2.8 trillion in the trust fund account. So what Treasury should be doing right now is to give Social Security its $2.8 trillion in the form of a bank account, okay, at the Fed. And then let's see the Treasury Department balance the budget. Laura says, thank you and good night. And Evelina says, good night. Some of these guys would probably want to pass a constitutional, would want to pass an amendment, okay, to balance the budget. Okay, depending on the wording of that amendment, okay, it might not allow us to deficit spend, or it still might allow us to deficit spend. It all depends on the wording. They have to word it really correctly for it to shackle the Congress. If they do shackle the Congress, though, they'd be taking away the monetary sovereignty of the United States, and they would subject us to all kinds of economic cycles and difficulties in the future, which would lead to a revolution in this country. The one stupidest thing that you could possibly do for this country is to pass a balanced budget amendment that actually stopped Congress from running deficits. That would be terrible. Okay, and Aurora DeBarra says, but depending upon how you define what a deficit is. Okay, so anyway, Aurora DeBarra says, thank you for sharing your wisdom with we, the new involved, for the right way for we, the people. Thank you, Aurora. Thank you very much for coming. Nice to see you. Susan said, so they would never really do a balanced budget amendment? I wouldn't put it past them. I mean, I mean, these people are really, all I can say, students, they're just asking for it. I mean, they are really stupid. If they pass a balanced budget amendment, they could pass one in a way so as to handcuff the Congress. That would be terrible for economic emergencies. It would be terrible for wars. It would be terrible for COVID emergencies. I mean, look at what would have happened now if we couldn't meet the COVID emergency by not doing deficit spending. Anyway, I'm going to call it a night. So good night. Please share, like, and subscribe the YouTube video when it goes up. And I'll be seeing you Monday night.